Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have with us Geoff Mulgan. Geoff is well known for everybody. He's a thinker, he's a teacher, he's someone that is always and with every time discussing the future. We have him last year when we celebrated the memory of Diogo Vasconcelos, that was a friend of many people that are here. And he has just launched, pode passar, Luís, a new book that is, first of all, yes, that is When Science First of all, okay, first of all, this is the 100 smart discussion. Geoff, this is the 100 smart discussion, and I think it's important to celebrate the times. We started with this 4 years ago within the pandemic, and in 4 years we organized already 100 smart discussion. I think it's interesting to have this platform for discussion, for sharing ideas, and it's always a pleasure to have people like you that with your very complicated agenda have a slot time to speak with us. But Geoff, as I was saying, you launched recently a fantastic book. I already recommended to everybody, When Science Meets Power. It's a very, very interesting reflection about the links and the connections between politics and science. And I think that's the lesson, because every time Geoff speaks, we have a lesson. We will have today, will be very interesting for those who don't have still the book, can have it. So, as usual, we are going to have first the keynote from our invitee, about 25, 30 minutes. I think it will be a very, very impressive and good lesson. And then we have discussion between the people that are participating. We have here people from academic, people from companies, people from the public administration. So, Geoff, it's a very wide and diversified participants, and I think the discussion can be very good. Thank you very much again.
Well, thank you very much, Jaime, and thank you all for being with me. I was almost going to be in Lisbon in about a week's time for an event with your mayor and others as part of Reimagine Europa, but I couldn't quite get the timings to work. So, apologies, I'm with you virtually. And just before I speak about science, I'm going to put in the chat a new initiative, which is something different, but which I'm actually announcing this week, which is a new project on the design of new public institutions. I've created a new little team. We are backed by the Rockefeller Foundation and working with several governments around the world on the design of new institutions. And you were talking just earlier about the media. One of our topics is likely to be, do we need new institutions around truth, around protecting democracy, protecting elections? But that's for another day. But if you have a look at the website, you will see the beginnings of a project. And if anyone in Portugal is interested in this topic or there are projects, please keep us in mind. So what I'm going to talk about, as Jaime said, is a book which is out, well, this month really, and which I'm trying to find ways of talking about it. I hope you can see the slide. Yeah, it's quite a complicated book, so I still slightly struggle to summarize it, but it was born out of the pandemic and seeing governments and politicians grapple with issues of science and sometimes struggling to know what to do. My own background is a mixture of working on the boundaries of government and science in city government, national government, European Commission. I've in the past done quite a lot on science advice and how you build science advice into government. I'm running a European project at the moment on whole of government approaches to research and innovation, which will complete in April this year. And I've been an advisor on STOA in the European Parliament. So I've lived some of the tensions I'm going to talk about in a moment. Now, perhaps this is obvious, but I think it may not be always obvious that the proportion of issues facing politicians and governments which involve science has been steadily rising. So top left, climate change is very much a matter where you have to understand the scientific analysis, both of the problem and the solutions. AI, if there's time, I will talk quite a bit about that. I think AI has shown the weaknesses of much of politics and government. And of course, we have just been through a pandemic, which very much depended on scientists, both to, again, understand it, but also to develop vaccines. And many, many other issues like mental health have a large scientific component. So politics is increasingly interwoven with science. And this is my theme. And sometimes politicians say, well, let's just follow the science. This is what our Prime Minister in Britain, Boris Johnson, said when the pandemic started. He said, my job is just to follow the science. But it turns out this is not actually possible to do. And anyone who understands science realizes you can't just follow it. Science is complex, ambiguous, and sometimes in tension with other ways of thinking and ways of being. And this was commented on very well by a man called Peter Gluckman, who was the chief science advisor in New Zealand and then chaired the international network of government science advisors. And in this quote, he simply says, so many problems now are simultaneously scientific and political. And I won't read out all of these, but they range from the legalization of recreational drugs to family violence, aging, agriculture, decarbonization. They are not either scientific or political, they are both. And any decisions have to be both. And therefore, the idea on any of these, you simply follow the science, is wrong. But equally wrong is the idea that politics can remain free from science, autonomous from science. Now, in the book, I talk about the paradox which follows from this. In a way, any large field of scientific change, like the advent of large language models in artificial intelligence, requires a response from politics. Only government, only politics ultimately can pass the laws, can regulate, can determine how to control technologies. And yet we're in this position where the scientists are generally very trusted. This is a survey from about 30 countries. And generally, civil servants, politicians, ministers are much less trusted. So how can the much less trusted roles govern, regulate, shape the much more trusted ones? This is the problem, particularly at the moment, as more and more issues are simultaneously political and scientific. Now, one answer is simply to almost ignore the science, and we will have probably back in the White House later this year, Donald Trump, who has been, in a sense, contemptuous of science, and during the pandemic proposed all sorts of strange remedies. And there are many politicians around the world who've chosen a position of anti-science or science skepticism and climate skepticism and so on. And a large body of opinion, I think, supports this. I've noticed in the UK, more and more people recently believing conspiracy theories, false news of all kinds. Perhaps a quarter, a fifth of the population is in this position. And you may remember his proposals for detergents. In some ways more interesting even than Trump is Ron DeSantis, who dropped out of the presidential race yesterday. But he had made a judgment that he should be even more anti-science than Donald Trump. And he called for, let's say there, a grand jury to investigate all the wrongs done by science-led government during the pandemic. And he was responding to an extraordinary shift of political opinion. This chart shows the share of American adults who have a great deal of confidence in science. And 50 years ago, Republicans were more pro-science than Democrats, but both were fairly pro-science. And then in the last 10 years, there's been this extraordinary polarization when the Democrats have actually become more pro-science, but the Republicans have become profoundly anti-science. And this is bound up with a whole series of shifts in culture and belief that makes it quite hard to function in an environment like that. We don't quite have the same in Europe yet, but it's one of those trends which could cross the Atlantic quite powerfully. Now, in some ways, science against anti-science is the relatively easy, for me at least. This is it's so obvious. We want to seek out facts and evidence and truth and science against falsehood, against lies, and so on. And I think we need much stronger institutions and even laws to do that. But in some ways, the trickier issues are the ones where it's not purely science against anti-science. So Anthony Fauci, who was often in tension with Donald Trump, was seen by many as the hero of rational science against the crazies. But this is a photograph from very problematic evidence he gave to Congress, where he was being questioned about why the US government had funded research in Wuhan, very dangerous research, including what's called gain-of-function research, testing out more and more dangerous viruses. And even though it seems there wasn't a leak from the Wuhan lab which led to the pandemic, his answers were not very impressive. It was clear there was a real problem of the scientists doing research without that much attention to their accountability to the public or to politicians. And this felt like a watershed moment of something going wrong in the relationship of science to politics, even for the more favorable, the more sympathetic people. And indeed, if you look at, and in my book, I start with this example of BSL-4 labs, which are the very, very dangerous labs doing highly risky research. Many of these are located in big cities. And yet most people in those cities are quite unaware that this work is being done in centers of population. So this is one symptom of perhaps a not very healthy relationship in terms of honesty, transparency, accountability of science to the public. And these are the labs which appear in Hollywood films with people dressed in biohazard suits. A very different example, I mentioned AI. I thought the moment when Rishi Sunak interviewed Elon Musk a few months ago, was really in some ways quite a low point of politicians was deferring to technologists to regulate themselves, and in some ways lacking the confidence to believe it was their job to govern science and technology. And he was almost, as many people pointed out, a bit like a job applicant being interviewed by Elon Musk for a future job rather than a confident leader. And again on AI, politicians don't really understand it and have often struggled to know what they should do. So the laws, the EU law only comes in next year, at least 15 years after AI became really part of many people's daily life. China's moved a little bit faster. The UK is still not really moving very much at all. And it mirrors what happened a generation ago with the internet. And sometimes I do a slightly mean trick on politicians and others. I ask them if they could give a 3-minute talk about how the internet works. Most of them use the internet 5, 6, 7 hours a day, maybe more. And almost none of them can explain even for 2 or 3 minutes how it works. Essentially for them, it's magic. And AI is magic too. And so it's perhaps not surprising, and I'll come back to this later, why we have this problem of governance. And I think it will only become more intense as next generations of technologies come along, like quantum, which could be the end of all privacy, or it could be a fantastic boon. We simply don't know. And synthetic biology, new generations of genomics, again, enormous potential benefits, but also extraordinary risks. And politics has not even really started to think about these except as sources of growth. So in the book, I look quite a lot at history, and I'll go through this very, very quickly. the history of how states used science and engineering all the way back to more than 2,000 years ago, as a great example from China of scientific engineering genius, solving problems, making regions prosperous, making emperors look smarter. And of course, in the present, we have so many examples, the Oppenheimer film, which is up for Oscars, about the very frontiers of science being exploited by governments for warfare. And many, many examples also of science being used for glory, really, not actually to win wars or anything, but for the prestige of states. And I think we still underestimate how much governments and politics uses science to amplify its glory, not actually for the economy or the population. In the last 100 years, though, we've seen this extraordinary change where everything has become more complex because of the realization that science itself creates both benefits but also risks. This was the insight of the ecological movement and of climate change, that all these advances create new problems. It's obviously true of AI. It's obviously true of genetic engineering of all kinds. And I think the sort of breakthrough ideas came from a woman I worked a little bit with at the end of her life, Mary Douglas, who was an anthropologist of risk, and who showed if you really look at risk, there is no sort of science of risk. You can't analyze it rationally. What you care about, what you worry about, how you think about risk depends on your culture, on the things you care about, on your values, on what you think matters. And to that extent, always will be political with a small p as well as a big P. And you can see this playing out in all the arguments on AI, whether it is whether we should be terrified of a new big brother, or terrified of corporate control, or terrified of robots taking over the jobs, or whether we see it as a wonderful new advance in human civilization. So the core of my argument, in a way, goes back to the 17th century, when two very different ideas crystallized. On the right was the idea of sovereignty, which became the core of modern politics, the idea that at first the ruler, but later the people, should be completely sovereign, should have control over everything. And many of our political institutions are grounded in that idea. And on the left is the slogan of the Royal Society, founded in London, whose slogan is nullius in verba, which means don't believe anyone's word, the scientific principle of doubt, skepticism, and experiment. And these two are, I argue, distinct, almost ways of viewing the world, distinct logics. I'll just jump over this because the core of the argument, my argument, is that essentially there are these, in any practical expression of government, there are these three different logics which just have different ways of thinking. The scientific on the left, neutral, skeptical, peer-based, impersonal, very long time horizons, sees new knowledge as inherently good. And then the political way of thinking, which is much more about stories and problem solving and pragmatic, empathizing with humans. And then between them, the bureaucrats, I've been a bureaucrat much of my life, who have a bias to order, predictability, rules, etc. And these three different ways of seeing the world do sometimes converge. They do converge on the handling of risk, economic growth, and others, but they're constantly in tension. And throughout the pandemic, we saw the three in tension again and again. And some of my book is describing the nature of those tensions and why these sort of pictures of, this was my prime minister trying to follow the science, flanked by two scientists who thought he was a bit of a fool in reality, and then try to turn these principles into bureaucratic form, welfare payments, rules for locking down schools, rules of who got vaccinated first. This created all sorts of challenges. So out of this, I then go through many of the practical issues which arise, and I'll go through this very quickly. So one is what is the role of the scientific advisor in government? And in the late 20th century, their numbers increased, and there was a whole sort of theory. Their job was to advise, and then the politicians would make all the core decisions. But that notion has slowly broken apart because when you're in a pandemic, the advisors often know so much, they're also often de facto making decisions, but they're not accountable for those decisions. So I argue for a series of changes to the nature of the role of advisors, and I won't go through these, in a way much more as knowledge orchestrators and brokers and synthesizers, rather than as standing outside and giving advice in. I talk about how we make everyday politics and government more scientific, more use of evidence in everyday decisions. And there are many institutions trying to do that. In the UK, we have a lot of, we call them what works centers, like in health, which decide what treatments are most effective. The US has an evidence-based act, was passed through Congress, actually, even when Donald Trump was last president. He had no role in it, but it's, it's part of the law. And you can see a steady rise of these institutions which provide at least an evidential input to any policy decisions. We're beginning to see the idea of R&D generalized. So most countries, or many countries, spend 2, 3, 4% of GDP on science, but they haven't in the past applied that to things like social policy or democracy itself, or the work of government itself. And that's beginning to change. Canada is an interesting trailblazer looking at what they call social R&D, with a whole series of programs extending really the scientific method, but into new social fields. And we go through that. There's a big debate in many countries too about whether the direction of science should be democratized. In the past, it was a strong view of scientists that they should decide what the priorities were for science, and there's some good reasons for that. Of course, business has often had a big influence, as have states. But sometimes the public interest has not been very strong in deciding the priorities. And a very interesting poll in the UK, and I don't know if there's an equivalent in Portugal, showed a minority of people actually think R&D benefits people like them. The most recent one said only 9% said they benefited a lot from government investment in R&D. And this is partly because the science world is very bad at communicating what it's doing, or communicating the local benefits. So another survey showed no one knew what was being done in their area, even when they lived in areas which had universities doing fantastic research. So there's a kind of broader politics of science question, how science explains what it's doing, why it's relevant, but also perhaps follows the public's views on what should be priorities, which are different, usually from the state or business or the scientists themselves. And then a set of institutional questions, which I look at, about how to get more sort of systematic living governance of science. So 50 years ago, many countries created offices of technology assessment, sometimes in parliaments. The US Congress had one. Some of them were then shut down, including the US ones, but these were attempts at creating hybrids where science and government and politics would be constantly looking at new technologies. And I write about a very good UK example set up 40 years ago called the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, which came out of a very big national debate and a parliamentary debate on cloning, in vitro fertilization, and so on. And ever since has had the powers to regulate what could be done, what could be experimented with, and broadly has kept both the pace of scientific advance, but also public support and legitimacy over many very sensitive decisions. But the oddity is, although we have this HFEA on fertilization, nothing like it was created for the internet. Nothing like it has yet been created for AI. So we have governance gaps on many of these hugely important areas where technology and politics, ethics and science interact, but without institutions to make legitimate judgments about where the boundaries should be. And I make lots of recommendations. Now, some of this is about synthesis and wisdom. And here I go back to the Ibsen play, The Enemy of the People, which I think is a really interesting and complex play. At one level, it's a play about a scientist, essentially, who finds out that, in this case, it's the waters of the town and the spa are infected, and he sort of speaks truth to power. And is then shut down by both the newspaper and the politicians. But in fact, the play is more subtle in Ibsen's mind, because he also points out the scientist doesn't do a very good job of thinking through the different dimensions of the issue. Why, there might be other issues at stake, other interests, not just the scientific one. And in a way, it brings to the fore that science, as I write there, has very powerful tools of analysis, but not such good tools for thinking across boundaries or synthesis. And this became very obvious during the pandemic. Here is just a list of the kinds of knowledge governments had to use to make decisions. And it includes scientific knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, but also knowledge of public opinion or implementation or politics or frontline experience. So lots of kinds of knowledge have to be synthesized together. And yet, if you look for the science of synthesis, it's quite weak. And this is one of the things which I think governments need to do much more systematically, is build up both their theory and their practice of complex synthesis, not just for pandemics, but also around issues like climate change. And I make various proposals on that. Now, perhaps two final things. One is a skills point. So, as I think I've suggested already, I think there is a skills gap for civil servants, there's a skills gap for the intermediaries, and there's certainly a skills gap for politicians. Next month, I'm going to publish a survey I've done of training around the world for civil servants, most of which is still very much grounded in law and economics, and these are important, but they are much weaker usually on science or data or digital, are all the sort of things which are now much more present in the daily life of governments. There are a few academies for politicians. This is one, top left is one in Australia, bottom left is the one for mayors, which Mike Bloomberg funds, and a right-hand one is one for China, which does train its politicians, its ministers, and governors very systematically with residential courses and tests and so on. But in Europe, we have almost nothing comparable. We assume they will learn on the job and improvise. And I think more and more that is not really tenable. The difficult jobs of making judgments involving very complex science require a different approach to political skills. I think I have a whole load there about the global dimension and AI. And some of the book is about what we need not only at a national level, but also the missing institutions we have globally. When the UN was created in the 1940s, a big focus was stopping war between states, and another focus was money. So we have an International Monetary Fund, we have a World Bank, we have various other funds like the UNDP, but almost nothing was set up around knowledge or science or data. And yet we now are in a world where these are far more important, where the most valuable companies on the planet are mainly organized around data, and yet there's nothing in the UN system to govern them. And indeed, there is nowhere globally where the world comes together to ask if its scientific capacity is being directed to the right priorities. About a year ago, I was part of a big project studying science and the SDGs. And we looked globally at the data on whether science and technology spending was aligned with what the world had decided were its most important priorities. And the simple conclusion was there wasn't much alignment at all. And so I think we will need a reconstruction of global governance to better reflect an era where science is so important to so many things. We've got some good examples like the IPCC in climate change, but that's an exception not the rule. And very finally, I'll just give one sort of bit of the story I tell, which is which I borrowed from Hegel, George Hegel. Some of you, if you have read Hegel, which is quite hard work, you may know his story of the master and the slave, or the master and the servant. And it's a very interesting story he tells of how a master first has all the power and the servant works for him. But over time, because the servant is doing things, is fixing things, is working in the real world, and the master is not doing very much, over time, the servant in some ways becomes more and more powerful. The master becomes more and more dependent on the servant. And I argue this is a little bit what's happened in the relationship of politics and science. 100 years ago, governments, politicians thought they were in charge. They were commissioning the new missiles, the new technologies, the new drugs and breakthroughs. But because science has developed such sophisticated systems for acting on the world, for learning, for thinking, for evidence, it has moved far ahead of the world of politics, which has progressed far less. It's still stuck in almost a craft world of improvisation. And so the master has become more and more dependent on the servant, less and less powerful in relation to the servant. And this has created these instabilities, the imbalances I was describing before. So I took my screen off because my slides were about to go into a long thing on artificial intelligence, and I thought we should leave more time for discussion than that. But I hope that gives a flavor both of the diagnosis of the many, many ways in which the relationship of science and politics is now problematic and difficult and not perfect, and some ideas about what the solutions might be, both in fighting anti-science, crazy falsities, conspiracy theories, but also recognizing that perhaps the mainstream, most pro-science views of 10, 20, 30 years ago are no longer fit for purpose and need rethinking as well. So I hope that's enough to get us started.
Yes, perfect, Geoff. As usual, it was a very, very, very interesting lesson. We have here lots of people that are connected with this topic. We don't have anyone that is interesting, but I will, as usual, try to have someone to ask. We have here with us Helena Freitas, that is a well-known scientist and a person that is involved in academia and things like that. Helena, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Do you want to make some comment or question to Geoff? Helena, I don't know if you are listening. Sometimes we have some problems in. Okay, I think she's not listening. We have with us also Geoff from London, a Portuguese lady, Maria do Céu Moraes, that is working in technology and also with science. Maria, do you want to make any comment, any question to Geoff?
Oh, yes, thank you so much, Jaime, for inviting me, and very, very nice to meet you and to learn about your book. I will definitely get it and see in more detail. So what you're writing about. So yes, I'm currently in London. I'm industry director at SAP. I specialize in driving digital innovation and transformation across consumer industries. Beyond my role at SAP, I'm also the founder of a business incubator called Circle, which is dedicated to nurturing startups in the fundraising process from pre-seed to Series A. So I have two questions, in fact, for you. So the first one would be, from all the technologies, which ones do you think will hold the most promise for addressing global challenges? And how you think we can foster an ecosystem that ensures that these technologies are developed in a responsible way and inclusive as well, to address the problem of inclusivity. That's one question. The other question would be, in your research and writings, you've likely encountered instances where the intersection of science and policy making did not go exactly as planned, and I would like to see if you could share an example and what lessons can today's technologists and policymakers learn from these examples and take it for future interactions.
Okay, Geoff, you don't mind we have 3 questions? I think it's better in terms of conversation. Okay, we have already Elena with us. Elena, how are you? We are not listening. So, do you want to make any comment and question to Geoff?
Please, I apologize. I had the Zoom suddenly shut down. I apologize. So I was
Okay, no
following.
problem, no problem. Okay,
Thank you.
please.
I will go afterwards. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, you cannot make any comment now? Okay. So,
I mean, I was thinking that Geoff was primarily responding to these 2 questions.
No. The idea is that we have 3 questions. So if you can make your comment or question, please.
Okay, then thank you very much for the chance to join
Yes,
you.
of course, it's a pleasure.
Unfortunately, I couldn't follow the entire discussion, the entire speech, because I was with some problems with my connection.
Okay.
My name is Elena Freitas. I'm a biologist and a scientist from the University of Coimbra. So I'm basically an academic, and I've been following the scientific policy for decades. And I really appreciate your narrative, because I find it very useful to bring some of major concerns that also from the side of science we do have, and because one of the critical issues that we tend to have, and it can affect, in fact, the science itself, is the kind of the perception that general societies can have upon science. And when we have situations where the commitment is not clearly, it's not transparent from the support of science and how far it goes, then the science itself suffers from this impact. And on the other hand, we have the progress of science currently is very much, it has to be interdisciplinary. And it is very difficult to, and that's probably one of the comments that I would like you to comment on this, because we are pushing science, at least, science that is publicly funded, which is most of it, but the science that is publicly funded has the challenge to respond to the societal commitment that is the very nature of science, or it should be. But at the same time, the effort of interdisciplinarity is huge, and the indicators that you have to respond and to assess your performance are still very much individual. So I would like to have your opinion on this. Is it possible to proceed with the challenge that the science and the scientific community has ahead, with the same kind of, the way how we've been organized and the way how the societies perceive science, or is it? Do you think this is going to be possible, really, to keep funding science and this new science that needs really to enlarge the scope of commitment and productivity in a way? So I don't know if I was clear. But I really think that you have the tools and the skills, and you have thought about this, I'm sure, because in a way this is going it's going to meet the kind of concerns you have raised.
Geoff, Elena was very humble. She's not only a biologist. She is one of the most remarkable scientists we have in Portugal. Okay, and she has lots.
But I'm an environmental activist, so you have to deal with
lots of prizes from European Commission, things like that. We have a final question from Miguel Henriques, and then we pass to you. Miguel, please. Miguel Henriques, would you like to make a comment? You put your hand.
Just give me a minute. Can you listen to me?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry, because I'm in the move. Just very quickly, Geoff, thanks very, very much for your amazing lecture. And my question is about the role of the media. I noticed in the graph you showed us about trustworthy, that the media were in the middle of the graph. Not people don't trust them very much, but still trust them like around 30%. what do you see as the role of the media between or in this game between science and politicians? Thank you.
Okay, Geoff. Now you can please answer to these first 3 questions, okay?
Thank you. Those are a lot of very profound questions. I'll try and be try and cover them all, and maybe working backwards. So on the last question about the role of the media, clearly in a democracy, it's vital that the people have some understanding of science, know what the truth is, know how to ask the right questions, know how to be skeptical. And I write a bit about the traditions of thinking in terms of scientific literacy and public education, which I think in some ways have become much more intense. The other chart I could have shown you is the recent one from the US about beliefs in the US, which shows, for example, that nearly 20% believe in there being a paedophile conspiracy of lizards running the power. Now, that's an enormous number of people. We know that a fifth of 20-something Americans believe the Holocaust was a hoax. So there's been a sharp decay of basic levels of knowledge and information, mainly driven by social media, not traditional media. It appears to correlate not with education, but with social media use. And I think requires much, as I say, stronger responses than we've had in the past. But that would take me quite a lot. That opens up another but very important set of issues. So they will be being discussed at the event in Lisbon next week with Reimagine Europa, which is studying it. Secondly, again, working backwards, this issue of interdisciplinarity is fascinating and so key. As you say, I mean, I'm not a biologist, but biology is creating all these sort of links to other neighboring disciplines, whether physics or bioinformatics and so on. And a lot of the creativity comes from hybrids, not trying to be all disciplines, but maybe 2 or 3 at the same time. I guess the 2 places I come at this are, one is understanding. So hence, I think the need for some training in synthetic thinking and synthetic methods. I was a little bit shocked coming into a university to realize it didn't do that at all. No one owned that as the intellectual problem, either for undergraduates, but or for the senior academics. I asked many, what's our approach to synthesis and wisdom, and didn't get good answers. And it's also a more practical issue for governments. And I mentioned the project I'm doing with the European Commission, where we are looking at how countries are organizing to take a more holistic interdisciplinary view. So the Netherlands, I think, is probably the most impressive, partly because it has a long tradition of advisory bodies and multidisciplinary advice, but also more recent programs like the top sector approach, which has linked in business in fields like agriculture. It's one of the reasons why the Netherlands is now the world's 2nd top exporter of agricultural products, which is amazing, given its size. And many other countries are looking at roadmaps and pathways for the circular economy or decarbonization, which is simultaneously multidisciplinary in a university sense. You need the material science, sometimes the biology, but also the economics, the psychology, and so on, but also in terms of the practicalities of business action. And then on the first question, so my PhD is in telecoms and digital, so I'm basically a sort of believer, perhaps sometimes maybe a naive believer in the virtue of digital to make the world a better place, to solve problems, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. There's an interesting scandal underway in the UK at the moment, which if you live in London, you may have seen, which was about the digitization of the post office network. I was a little bit involved in it right at the beginning because I recommended cancelling the technology, which then caused hundreds of local post office owners to be wrongly charged with fraud for stealing money. And it turned out to be the software which was wrong, not them. Now, to me, there are many morals of this story, but two general ones are, firstly, it again showed up the lack of capability in government at the time. There were many people with financial skills, but far too few people who understood digital, knew to ask the right questions, knew to be skeptical in a healthy way. And that's come out very clearly from a current public inquiry. But the other was that the technology was imposed on these people with almost no involvement. The users, the frontline users, were not involved in its shaping at all. They were purely passive. And I think what we've learned again and again in digital is you need to involve your customers, your users in the design process, in the development of software, in the testing, if things are going to work well. And so that's a much bigger sort of moral, which often that does happen. But finally, in relation to AI, quantum, and all these other digital technologies, which could have huge impact in the next 10 or 20 years, I still think it's extraordinary how little money goes into the development of AI for the SDGs or for social good relative to what's spent for military purposes or for advertising, let's say. There are lots of programs with the right labels now, but if you look at the scale is still very, very small compared to the other purposes. So I think there is a bit of an imbalance still in our digital ecosystems. And perhaps just finally, Jaime, there's probably one crucial thing I should have said, which I didn't say. And in a way, it's the summary of the whole book can be summed up in one sentence, which I failed to say, which you can argue with. But essentially, I say that what science does so well is it tells us what is, the facts of the world. And it's an incredible gift to be surrounded by science, which helps us know how things work, what really is happening. But science doesn't tell us what matters. It doesn't tell us what we should care about or what we should value. And politics at its best is a way for society to think about what matters, what it cares about. And that's, in a way, their division of labor, the scientists to tell us the facts, the truths, and the scientists and the politicians with society to decide what we really care about, what we want, what risks we really fear, what things we hope for. And I think often scientists think that they are the answer to the problems of politics. They are sometimes, but often they can never answer this question of what matters. And sometimes the politicians think they don't need the science, like Donald Trump, but yes, they do, because you need to know the facts before you can act in the world.
Okay, so we go now for a second round. We have here Philippe Santos, that was with you last year when we spoke about your yourselves, about social innovation. Philippe, it's a pleasure to have you here. And then we have other people that I will pass the word. Philippe, please.
Hello, Jaime. Hello, Geoff.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and a pleasure to listen to Geoff always. I've been a big fan of his work in social investment, social innovation in the UK, and had the pleasure of sharing a few stages with him, discussing some of these issues. Thank you for a very interesting reflection on the intersection between science and policy and power. I would be interested in understanding a bit more. There has been recently a bit more controversy or discussion about the role of public investments in science and in other areas, with the argument by some economists that we should, that the world has developed based on a lot of public investment, that it seems that we trust too much private sector investment, and we should retain or we should refocus a lot public budgets on scientific basic R&D and scientific developments in different areas, with historical examples of how important it was, and we are here with the internet because of CERN and many other examples. On the other hand, as you said, scientific advancements are increasingly complex, increasingly costly, and sometimes directions are not clear. And so what's the ability of a government official to set the direction of what should be investigated as opposed to let the market make those choices and evolve. So there is a debate about the function of a more interventive function, also on industrial policy, on investment, versus a more supervisory function and regulatory. How do you see that debate, and from which side do you agree more, or what are the perspectives that are relevant for us to understand in that debate?
We have also with us Geoff that is strongly involved in science, in innovation projects. He was the president some years ago of the National Agency for Innovation. So, Geoff, you want to make any comment or question to Geoff, please? And thank you very much for being here.
Oh, thank you for the invitation, and thank Geoff for the great presentation. Well, actually, I have a comment and a small question. After my comment is very much linked to the last sentence that Geoff made. Because from my experience, I'm a very big believer and supporter of science-based policy. But in my experience, for it to work, really, we have to understand that these are two very different levels of intervention. So scientists can bring, as you said, the knowledge, the information to inform the political decisions. But then politicians, they need to be able to take their decision, even if they go against some of the data or the information or the knowledge that comes from science, because otherwise there is always going to be a difficulty for first politicians to hear scientists, because then they will feel somehow influenced or limited by the decisions. So we need to understand that these are very different levels. They are both very important, but they cannot be mixed or made too much dependent. Now, so that will be my comment, and I think it's a little bit linked to your last sentence that I think it was very important. Well, my small question is, what about policy-based science? So which means when politicians used or try to somehow influence science in the way that is convenient for their the political ideas or their political actions. And one way of doing it, of course, is when since you are the one taking decisions on the funding of science, of course, you can use this power to somehow try to shape or to put some barriers to the scientific activities or to those who are making science. And I think that, I think we have a lot of good examples of still, although I think there are still good examples or several examples of science-based policy, but unfortunately, I think we also have at least as many examples of policy-based science. That'll be my question to you. Thank you.
And Geoff, finally, Luis Maia, you want to make some brief questions, okay? Please be very brief.
Okay, Geoff, in fact, linked to the previous question, as far as the complexity goes, more complex gets the science, especially the cybernetic world, AI. For me, it seems that politicians will be less and less capable of understanding and therefore make the best decisions out of something that they don't understand. Especially when I look at the time. So political time is very short. Many times mandates are 4, 8, 12 years, while the science effects are long lasting and so they are more permanent. So the times are very different. How can politicians that have a short life, let's say, take decisions based on things that are so deeply and profoundly impacting our societies? Second question, very linked to this, new generations of politicians. Do you think they are coping better with this challenge? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff, please. Yes, Geoff, you can answer. Yes,
well,
thank you.
Thank you. These are really good questions, and each could warrant much discussion. Well, let me start at the beginning, and I'll end with that last question. So first of all, Felipe's questions about, in some ways, the economics of science and the role of the state. Should it have any role? Should it be only funding basic research and not getting too downstream? So in a way, the conventional wisdom in the past was the government should be quite involved. I think economists forgot what was the norm in the mid-20th century. The governments of the US or Japan or Germany or the UK or France invested very heavily in science and technology, sometimes got quite involved in detailed shaping. That was the norm. There was then perhaps in the 90s, 2000s, a sort of drift to a view, leave it all to the market. And if governments do anything, it should be very, very basic research. That was never actually the behavior of real governments, but it was common in economic theory. And now there's a bit of a swing back to more involvement in shaping. This is a very complex issue. I'll just make very brief comments on it. One is that I think the answers to this depend very much on the size of the country. If you are the US, you can do all of these things. You can have a very well-funded DARPA and NASA, but also lots of other funds and funding for small business. You can do the most basic and the most applied. The great majority of countries do not have that option. And if they spend too much upstream, much of their knowledge will be captured by others. And I think there's a lot of confusion on this issue, just if people ignore the question of scale and options. Secondly, and it gets back to my point on capability, if you are as a government going to start making judgments about the direction of the detailed direction of your economy, you really need a lot of capability. And the worst thing is for governments to act without deep skills and deep knowledge, and then they're bound to make mistakes. The UK in the last 70 years is full of examples of that, of well-intentioned, badly executed attempts to, I showed a picture of Concorde earlier. Unfortunately, there are many, many examples of that kind. And often this is done best through specialist arm's length bodies like NASA, rather than to overly generalist ones. Secondly, Jose, your questions, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I think it's important that politicians can reject science. I've sometimes used the line, politicians have every right to ignore the evidence, but they have no right to be ignorant of the evidence. So they need to engage with the science, and then sometimes they can decide, well, actually, I still want to do this policy or this program, but they have to first have engaged with the facts. And as you say, there is a lot of policy-based science around. In the book, I argue, obviously, there are examples from the Nazis, Lysenko and Stalinism. In the current world, I think India is the prime example, where Narendra Modi is trying to create a Hindu science, is trying to shift funding to a very distinct view of science. I don't think this will serve India well. India has fantastic scientific capability, and most scientists in India are deeply troubled by this unhealthy politicization of science by the BJP. And then finally, this last question must be right. So, and this is in a way the problem of my argument, and well, the problem of where we are. I think science is becoming more complex and more opaque. Many people working on large language models, or let's say the Google search, even they don't really understand how it works the way it does. So technology is actually becoming a bit more like magic, genuinely. And of course, and that makes it even harder for politicians to catch up with understanding. And as you say, too, the time horizons of science and the time horizons of politics are perhaps even more different. If you are investing in a collider, a particle collider, or a new drug, these take decades to have any impact. Now, I think part of the answer, and I put this in the book, is to create, again, hybrid organizations, which are a little bit removed from day-to-day party politics, but still have a political input, which can make decisions on the allocation of money, can make decisions on these longer-term issues. And I think the opacity of science makes it even more important that we invest heavily in the skills of our politicians and the civil servants. They may not be able to catch up with understanding quantum computing, but at least they may not fall so far behind that they are completely clueless about what is to be done. But all of your questions, in a way, are reasons why this is, and this is perhaps my final point. I think more and more in this century, the job of politics and government will, at every turn, involve science, involve engagement with science. And even 30, 40 years ago, science was seen as something slightly marginal. You would have science advisors, you might consult universities about spending, but most of the day-to-day work of politics and government didn't really intersect with science. That is no longer the case. All of these difficult issues, which, as I say, you've all raised, are now core. They're absolutely at the heart of our society's dilemmas, whether it is climate change or AI or childhood or clean air or what to do with synthetic biology. And I hope in my book, at least, I give some frames, some examples, but I don't pretend to answer all the questions at all. These are the questions we will all be living with for the next few decades, I think.
Geoff, I think it's time to close because, we have already 1 hour and 5 minutes. Thank you very much for your lesson.
Thank you all.
Everyone is going to buy the book, the ones that don't have it. And we expect to have here in Portugal very soon, okay? We'll treat for that. Thank you very much and have a nice week, okay? Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you.
It was a pleasure, okay? Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.